And welcome to Weighed in the Balance, the show where we examine to see if claims can hold scrutiny. Today, we are going to be dealing with a philosophical problem, and so, of course, I had to bring in our resident philosopher, Mr. Josh Goodwin. Josh, how are you today?
I'm all right. I feel like you may be overselling me a bit, but we'll see what happens.
No, you have the piece of paper, and so
That's true. I'm looking at it right
yes.
now.
Yeah. It looks so lovely on the wall, right?
All those dollar signs.
That is what we say about degrees that don't actually get you a job, is that they look so lovely on the wall.
Wait, you mean I'm not getting paid for this?
No. This channel doesn't make money.
Oh, right.
Tell your wife je suis désolé.
I'll pretend to understand what that meant.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
All right.
For those of you that don't know, Josh, he had not, we are old friends. We go back over 10 years. He had not told me he was dating anyone until I got the save the date for his wedding. And I opened my mailbox and there's a picture of Josh with some girl and telling me to come to their marriage. And
did it work for the joke?
Well, so my wife actually opened it first and said, Jonathan, is there something you forgot to tell me? And I just looked at it and I was like, nope, didn't know.
I'll be honest, that's exactly what I was hoping would happen.
Then I get to the wedding and she's taking her vows in French. I was like, wow, did not tell me he was dating anyone and he's marrying a French girl. Like, I thought we were friends.
I was very committed to that bit.
Yes, very committed. Well, but see, now I've just taken to texting him things that he has to get his French wife to translate, because I do know juste un peu de français. And so
I don't.
Yeah, but you understood that.
Context.
Yeah. I was speaking with my hands. Yeah, just a little bit of French. Anyway, today we are going to be looking at an atheist's attempt to respond to Mr. soon-to-be doctor, I think, Wes Huff. For those of you that don't know, Wes kind of blew up on the scene 6 months or so ago, and it was because of an interaction that he had with a guy named Billy Carson. Have you seen that interaction, Josh?
I have. It was, I think, a bloodbath would be the correct way of phrasing it.
It was embarrassing.
Yeah, not great.
I felt bad for Billy.
Yeah.
And I have described it elsewhere as he humiliated that man in the most polite way possible. Is the most Canadian thing ever. Yeah. It was awesome.
But to say he is Canadian, so yeah. To be fair, I think Billy Carson kind of humiliated himself, but yeah.
Well, let's hear what Wes has to say and what our atheist friend has to say in response.
Where Christianity is different is that the punishment that we deserve is taken on God himself in the person of Jesus. And so in that sense, justice is fulfilled.
God made a creation that he was going to judge based off if they were good enough. And he actually made it so that they cannot be good enough. Every single time a believer, an apologist, an evangelist, whatever, says, you cannot be good enough, I hear an admission of God messing up. Whose fault is that? If nobody in the history of humanity can be good enough, then nobody is at fault. Only the creator of that system and of those bodies. It's truly that simple.
Where Christianity is different.
It is truly that simple. So the argument is that because God requires perfect righteousness and yet mankind cannot achieve perfect righteousness, this is a deficiency or a shortcoming on the part of God. Is that more or less what he's saying?
Yeah, I mean, he's noticed the language that he uses, right? God made it so that no one could meet that standard, therefore God is at fault. So yeah, he's arguing that this is either a shortcoming or, if we follow the language that he's using, an active mistake or possibly even an act of sort of divine negligence because of the way God designed this system.
Right. What I heard when I listened to this is this guy is obviously not a professional. I don't think he has a philosophy degree like our esteemed co-host today.
For his sake, I hope he doesn't.
He's putting it in a very sort of layman's level way of phrasing it. But what I heard was that the existence of evil creates a situation where if God existed, then he failed. But God is all powerful and can do anything. Therefore, it creates a logical problem. Is that how you heard that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to. I think we have to take a couple of steps to connect the two. So we would have to say, he says God made this system where man can't meet his standards. Well, what causes man to be unable to meet those standards? Sin or evil? So yeah, I think that's a fair way of phrasing it. Essentially, the existence of God and the existence of evil, or the existence, or the possibility rather, of man committing evil actions or making evil choices, he's saying is inconsistent.
Right. And this actually is something that we learn about in philosophy classes and apologetics classes. It's called the logical problem of evil.
It is. And I actually have that pulled up if you would like me to show it.
I would. Please, Professor Goodwin, please.
So, yes, this is the logical problem of evil. Again, this isn't exactly the way that he was phrasing it, but his argument is following a very similar format. So, the logical problem: if God were all-powerful, he could create any world he wants. In the context of this argument, he could create a world in which man was capable of fulfilling his standards, meeting his standards, and what have you. If he were all-loving, he would want to create this type of world. He would want to create a world free from evil and suffering. He would want to create a world in which man was able to meet those standards. Evil and suffering exist, or man falls short of those standards. Therefore, this is either a shortcoming on God's power, he's not able to create this world, or it's a shortcoming of his love or benevolence, he doesn't want to. And in either case, why call him God? More simply, therefore, God doesn't exist. So this is the logical problem. If these premises are true, then yeah, the conclusion does seem to follow, but as I suspect we'll get into shortly, one or more of them may not be entirely accurate.
So, are there, for example, if we wanted to say the flying spaghetti monster argument, if we could call it that, we can think of that's Richard Dawkins' argument, right? The divine
Argument,
North
maybe
Korea
overstating
argument.
it,
That's the. Well, yeah, no, I'm definitely overstating both of these.
Yeah.
Like the divine North Korea argument, that's Christopher Hitchens. Are there any well-known historical atheists that use this argument?
Not anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been...
Why is that?
Well, it's been pretty effectively dismantled. Alvin Plantinga played a big part in that.
Yeah. Well, why don't people use this argument anymore?
So, this is a deductive argument. I don't know if you've gotten into deductive, inductive before on the podcast, but...
We have not. Please
this is
educate
fun.
us.
All right, how much time do we have? No, in a logically deductive argument, if the premises are true, the structure is such that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true by necessity. The go-to example that I use ad nauseum in my class is all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If those premises are true, it's not possible for the conclusion to be false. And we can swap in whatever terms we want. I like to say all reptilians are mortal, Socrates is reptilian, therefore Socrates is mortal. The premises are untrue. Well, as far as we know, they're untrue. But the structure guarantees the conclusion. If those premises are true, the conclusion can't possibly be false. Which means that if we want to show that a deductive argument is invalid, if we want to dismantle a deductive argument, one way we can do that, and one approach that's been taken with the logical problem of evil, is to show that even if the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. So, all that we have to do is show that if the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. So in premise 4, God's either not all-powerful or not all-loving. It's setting up, this whole thing is setting up basically a dilemma, right? Either God is powerful and loving, or evil exists. Evil exists, therefore God's not powerful and loving. All we have to do, though, is show that there's a third possibility. Maybe God is perfectly capable of preventing evil. Maybe he's completely loving. But maybe, again, and we say maybe it's logically possible that God has some other sufficient reason for allowing evil and suffering to exist. If it's even logically possible that God could have a reason for allowing evil, the argument collapses because we don't just have these two choices. We don't just have evil or God is loving and powerful. And we can talk about what some of those reasons may be.
Well, it sounds to me like the problem with this argument is not its structure. Like in philosophy classes, you learn about different types of syllogisms, and was it Aristotle that like wrote out all the different ways that an argument can be logically valid and came up with all these different kinds of syllogisms? Am I remembering that, or was that Plato?
He did. Aristotle did that with categorical syllogisms. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you have like modus ponens. If A, then B. A, therefore B. If it is raining outside, I need an umbrella. It is raining outside, therefore I need an umbrella. Right? Modus tollens. If A, then B. Not B, therefore not A. If it is raining outside, I need an umbrella. I don't need an umbrella, therefore it is not raining outside. And there can be logical fallacies, like, for example, with modus ponens, you can affirm the consequent, right? Because it's a logical fallacy to say if A, then B, B, therefore A. Well, no.
Yeah.
Right.
If you're
if
from,
it is,
we say if you're from South Carolina, then you're from America. Premise 2, I am from America, therefore I'm from South Carolina. Well, obviously that doesn't follow. In the same way that I'm from South Carolina, therefore I'm from America would follow.
right. And then with modus tollens, you can affirm the consequent, but that doesn't logically follow.
Deny the antecedent.
Or deny the antecedent. Thank you. With modus tollens, you can deny the antecedent.
Right. If you're from South Carolina, you're from America. I'm not from South Carolina, therefore I'm not from America. Obviously false.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense. So, and there can be other fallacies, like you and I were talking the other day about the composition fallacy. And the way I was trying to explain it to somebody is like, hydrogen is flammable. Water contains hydrogen. Therefore, water is flammable. Well, that's a logical fallacy because you're taking an attribute of a part and attributing it to the whole. So there are all sorts of different logical fallacies, but you don't even have to engage in a logical fallacy for your argument to be wrong. For example, you can have a perfectly logically consistent argument. If I go outside, then I will get $1 million. I went outside, therefore I get $1 million. That's logically valid. The problem is premise 1 is not true. Nobody's going to give me $1 million for walking outside.
Well, not with that attitude.
I think that's the problem with this argument, is that there are some false premises. Am I on the right track with that?
I think so. As presented, we would have to break down, okay, well, what does it mean that God could create any world he wants? Is that actually the case? I don't think so. Premise 2, I think, is just a problem of not being very clear. He would want to create a world free from evil and suffering. Okay, well, when we say he would want to, what do we mean by that? Is he actively willing that? Is that a desire that he has? That could get into a discussion of different types, the different wills of God, the different types of things that God may will to do. I think I think that's also an approach we can take when looking at this argument.
Yeah, well, because with premise one there, if God were all powerful, he could create any world he wants. Everybody knows the classic example. Like there's two philosophy questions that people know because they're, in most people's opinions, kind of silly. One is, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? And like anybody who has any passing knowledge of philosophy knows that that's a question. The other one is, could God make a rock so big that even he couldn't lift it? And
Checkmate, Christians.
Yes. The first question actually does have some philosophical, like, oh, that's very interesting for somebody that's never thought of it before, right? Because, like, what is sound? Well, sound is what we hear, but if no one's there to hear it, is it really sound, right? You can at least get to a place where that is like, okay, I see what you're doing there. Rock that even he can't lift it is a logical contradiction. No one contends that God can create logical contradictions, because logic, at least from the Reform perspective, and I think you would agree on this as well, logic is part of who God is. God cannot do something that is inconsistent with who he is.
Right. We could spend a lot of time fleshing that out, but yes, I would more or less agree that the laws of logic would be in some sense rooted in the nature and character of.
Yeah. And so premise one, if God were all powerful, he could create any world he wants. Well, I mean, God can't create a world where there's a four-sided triangle. So on its face, premise one actually isn't true. Now, what I think they're trying to get to is, if God were all powerful, he could create a world without suffering. And I don't know that anybody necessarily disputes that God could. The question is, could God have a sufficient reason to allow the evil and the suffering that he does?
Right. And let's phrase it, because this slide is disconnected from the clip that we watch. I didn't find this or build this based on that clip. So let's, we try to make it connected a little bit more closely. If God were all powerful, he could create a world in which his creations were able to meet his standards of goodness or righteousness. Maybe.
Well, the thing is, I think all Christian traditions say that that's what he did. Let me pull up on my end here. This is the Westminster Shorter Catechism. So if we go down here to question 10, how did God create man? God created man, male and female, after his own image, in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, with dominion over the creatures. Now, the Shorter Catechism is, I know this is going to be a shocker, the short version. It is the version that they wrote to teach the faith to children. They expanded on that in the larger catechism, even though the larger catechism was written first. So technically they took the larger catechism and distilled it down to the Shorter Catechism. But the larger catechism is more expanded. Question 17 in the larger catechism, how did God create man? Answer is, after God had made all other creatures, he created man, male and female, formed the body of the man of the dust of the ground and the woman of the rib of the man, endued them with living, reasonable, and immortal souls, made them after his own image in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, having the law of God written in their hearts, and power to fulfill it, and dominion over the creatures, yet subject to fall. So the Reformed answer is that God created man able to keep his law, but also able to fall. The way Augustine put it is that man was created passe peccare, passe non peccare, able to sin, but also able not to sin. And I think that is agreed upon, certainly by everyone in the West, and I think that the East would agree as well, that is sort of a baseline Christian doctrine.
So it sounds like God creates man with some concept of free will. He can meaningfully choose to follow God, or he can choose to follow something else. In the case of the creation story, his own pride and glory.
Yeah, and nobody disputes that. There are disagreements as far as exactly how that plays out, because the problem of evil is not something that the Christian church has never thought about. Like, why did God allow there to be a fall? There are different explanations as to why God would allow sin to enter the world. Right? There's the simple foreknowledge explanation, which is essentially that God sort of took the information in, that the actions of the creature, the free creature, are outside of his control because that's the way he wanted it to be. He wanted there to be free creatures that made their own choice, and because he knew that they would make the wrong choice, then on that basis, he had the plan to have redemption in Jesus Christ. Is that, I know neither of us hold this position, is that at least a fair way of representing it?
I think so. The idea, I mean, we say out of God's control, those who hold the simple foreknowledge may take issue with that phrasing, but essentially...
Which is why I tried to say that it's out of his control because he chose to place it out of his control.
Right, I think that's fair. He intends a world in which creatures are free, thus maybe it would be more fair to say he chooses not to intervene or not to mess with the choices that they make. But yeah, I think that's a fair characterization.
Right. And then there's the view that you lean towards, which is the Molinist view, where there was a guy in the 16th century, his name was Louis de Molina, who came up with this framework of, because God knows all logical counterfactuals, so basically what can logically take place and what would logically take place under any set of circumstances.
Yeah, we say
because of that,
all possible worlds, I think, would be a way. That's how I would phrase it. Just simple, I think a little bit simpler, but yes.
Right. Given a set of circumstances, God knows what would happen. And on that basis, he then created a set of circumstances in order to achieve the outcome that he wanted. That's the Molinist view.
Essentially, yeah.
Basically, this way of articulating it boils down to, look, you might not think that these circumstances that God allows, some of which includes allowing evil, you might not think that it's the best version of things, but God, because he knows more than you, knows that it's the best version that he could have created, and so that is what he chose to create. Again, this isn't my view, so I'm asking if I'm being fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, you say God knows all possible worlds, and he chooses the world that he wishes to instantiate. I would differ a little bit in that I don't know that it's necessary to say that God chooses the best of those worlds, because that gets into sort of this Leibnizian idea of God having to create the greatest possible world that he's capable of creating. I think that gets into a little bit of tricky philosophy where I don't know that there is such a possible world. If this is going too deep into the weeds, then cut me off.
No, I think what you're saying is that regardless of whether you're saying that God chose the best possible world or just the world that he chose for his own reasons, that what God predestined was the circumstances under which free agents would do certain things. That's the distinction that makes Molinism what it is.
Right.
And why God chose to actualize those circumstances is a decision that he makes for his own reasons. But that's the explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Then there is my tradition's view, which is that God, from all eternity, predestined all things whatsoever comes to pass, but God is not the author of sin, and God does not do violence to the will of the creatures, that there are secondary contingent causes that remain free and contingent, but God's decree is still final and complete, effectual, however you want to put it. We distinguish between responsibility and culpability. And if you want to go really deep on that, there is a book called Excusing Sinners and Blaming God, which was a PhD dissertation. And you can read all of that lovely compatibilist philosophy, which I'm not actually really qualified to get into fully, but that is the position that the Reformed hold, is called compatibilism. That God predetermines all things that come to pass, but creatures are still free, and that those two are compatible with one another. Within the Reformed tradition, there are two ways of articulating that based on the logical order of God's decree. So there is the supra-lapsarian position, where God decrees that he will save a people in Jesus Christ, but therefore, if you're going to save people, you need something to save them from, so he decrees that there will be a fall so that he can save people. That's not my position. My position is what's called the infra-lapsarian position, where God in his decree decrees that he will allow man to fall into sin, but that he will not leave man in sin and misery, but will send a savior. So that's my position. It's the infralapsarian position. You notice we haven't necessarily, we've both said which position we hold, but we haven't argued extensively for our positions. The reason is because it doesn't matter which one is true. If any of these are logically possible, then the logical problem of evil falls apart.
Everything we've been talking about is, here, I'll bring this back up. Everything we've been talking about is granting a third possible option. The shorthand is the free will defense. If God were all powerful, he could create any world he wants. If he were loving, he would choose to create a world free from evil and suffering, unless he chooses, he wills, he desires to create a world in which creatures have free will, in which case, if they're free, again, God can't give and withhold free will from a creature at the same time. That's a contradiction. So if he wants creatures to be free, with that comes the possibility of them using that freedom for things other than what he would want them to use it for. He can't create free creatures who always choose the right thing, because that's no longer free will. He can't intervene with free will and still call it free will. Now, like you said, regardless, we've basically outlined three different views, or two different views on free will. Essentially, two different views on free will, three possible responses we could give.
Yeah, because the Molinist and the Simple Foreknowledge both have a libertarian, not politically libertarian, philosophically libertarian view of free will.
Actually, I think the Molinist could probably go either way. I think typically they would probably go libertarian, but I feel like they could go either way. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, but so free will can either be libertarian or compatibilist, but to your point that they are both, at the end of the day, God is not the author of sin. Man by the instigation of the devil is the author of sin.
Right. So to the point of the video, why did God create this system in which man was incapable of meeting his standards? Well, he didn't. He created a system in which man was free, and by man's free choices, he chose to violate the laws of God. Right? So we can't. Now we could say, well, why didn't God just create creatures that weren't free? Well, I mean, that we could get. Do you have any thoughts? I could think of some of the shorthand responses.
Well, I think that if we go back to the shorter catechism here, we need to start with first principles. So, question 4, what is God? God is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. Now, in this, you have what are called the incommunicable attributes. Incommunicable, if you think about this like you would sickness, right? The flu is a communicable sickness. Cancer is an incommunicable sickness. You can't catch it, right? So God's incommunicable attributes are attributes that only he possesses. Only God is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. But there are also the communicable attributes in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. Now, I would argue that to have a being, I think, carries with it the idea of having some sort of volition. We would have to maybe delve into that a little bit more, and if somebody wants me to, I would be happy to. But being that man is, you go down here, how did God create man? God created man after his own image. We know that God has a will and a volition, and man created in God's image will also have a will and a volition, which I'm saying the same thing twice, that the ability to make choices. Now, God created man also having being, wisdom. We do have wisdom. God has infinite wisdom. We have finite wisdom. God has unlimited power. We have to actually like cultivate our power. You have to go to the gym, theoretically. I wouldn't know. I haven't been in a very long time. But right, in order to cultivate the power of your body, holiness, you got to work at that. Justice, goodness, truth, these are all things that we possess in an imperfect way, whereas God possesses them in a perfect way. And so to say that man could not have a will at all, I think is inconsistent with being created in God's image and having those communicable attributes that we in some sense share with God. Only God has them to the degree that he does, but man created in his image, using our wills, are to, what is the chief end of man? I won't pull it back up. What is the chief end of man? The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. How can you enjoy something if you do not have a will of your own? It doesn't make sense.
Right. How could God have meaningful relationship with mindless robots?
Yeah. And nobody holds that view. Reformed or Arminian or Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholic, nobody holds that man doesn't have a will. And you and I were talking before we hit record about like, well, couldn't God have just created a mankind that couldn't fall into sin? And you had an interesting take on it based on a theologian from the United Kingdom from back in the day.
Yeah, so I would appeal to Anselm's definition of God as the greatest conceivable being, or in more modern terms, God as the greatest possible being, which I think is fair. If we're talking about a being and calling him God, but we're saying he's not the best, we could imagine something better. Okay, well, why not call that better being God instead? So I think it seems like a definition that most people would agree on, even if they don't believe in God. If God exists, he would exist as the greatest possible being. Essentially, we're talking about a being that's perfect in power and knowledge and wisdom and justice and goodness, everything from the catechism that was listed in the catechism. So for asking, why can't God just create other beings who are perfect in wisdom and power and holiness and justice? We're saying, can God clone himself? Can God create another being that is his equal? But to ask that is to ask if God can do something that I would argue is logically impossible. If God is the greatest possible being, then no other being could ever be as powerful as God. No matter what type of being he created, it's always going to fall short of his greatness and his perfection. So again, putting it in the...
It's almost asking if God could create another God.
Yeah, exactly. Could he create another God? No, because again, God is the greatest possible being. Nothing could ever be as powerful as him.
Now, there is a rejoinder, though, on the other side of this. So, remember I said Augustine said that man was created posse peccare, posse non peccare, able to sin and able not to sin. Man chose to sin and fell under the curse of sin, which I have often likened to it being, yes, a scripture does call it a curse, but it's also just the consequences of what sin is, right? Don't smoke cigarettes for 50 years and not expect to have health problems. Don't sin and not expect to fall under the curse of sin. That's the analogy that I've used. And the curse of sin made it so that whereas before man was posse peccare, posse non peccare, now man is non posse, non peccare, not able not to sin. Now, did God create man that way? No. It was man, by the instigation of the devil, that put man in that situation by eating of the forbidden fruit and incurring the consequences. When Christ came and bore our sins in his body on the tree, it was in order that we might what? Die to sin and live to righteousness. So now those who are in Christ are posse non peccare. They're able not to sin. Not that they always do not sin, but they're at least able not to sin. But when Christ returns, and there's the final judgment in the new heavens and the new earth, Augustine teaches, and I believe Scripture teaches, that man will be non posse peccare, not able to sin. So there is a scenario in which a created being is not able to sin, but it was always in Scripture held out as the reward of the covenant. right? In the covenant of works in the garden, man was, goodness, when God had created man, he entered into a covenant of life with him upon condition of perfect obedience, forbidding him to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil upon pain of death. Right? Those are the terms of the covenant. And there was also in the garden, though, the tree of life, where if he ate it, he would live forever. And there is, amongst many theologians, this idea that it was a probation testing period, that if he chose to be his own God by eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he would incur all that came with that, the curse of sin. But if he took hold of God's promise in the tree of life, then he would live forever. And that essentially, if Adam had chosen not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and had believed in the promises of God, that we could have gotten to the new heavens and the new earth really quickly. But of course he didn't. And so that's sort of just like philosophers try to think of like really, very interesting questions that are only interesting to philosophers. Theologians do the same thing. The covenant of works, though, doesn't go away after Adam, because Jesus kept the covenant of works, right? And I love the contrast between Adam and Jesus. Adam was in a garden that God made just for him, that had everything he could ever want. He had his beautiful wife by his side. He was literally the king of the world. He wasn't on a boat like Leo, but he was the king of the world. Thank you for getting that.
Yeah.
And that wasn't enough. He wanted more. He didn't want to just be the ruler over all creation. He wanted to have God's spot. Whereas Christ, though he was en morphe to theou, in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant. As Derek Thomas says, what did he empty himself of? Don't answer that question. If you do, you're a heretic. All we know is that he emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant and being made in the likeness of men. So Jesus was actually in the form of God, in the presence of the Father, and he chose to humble himself. And then where Adam was tempted with a full belly in a lush garden, everything he could ever want, Jesus, when he's tempted by the devil, where is he? He hasn't eaten for 40 days. He's in the desert. He is tired and hungry and weak, and he succeeded where Adam failed. And so Jesus, for his people, gets the reward of the covenant of works. He takes the penalty of the covenant of works, gives us the reward of the covenant of works, and achieves for us this state where we cannot sin. But to your point, there was always going to be a possibility that sin could enter, because the ability not to sin is a gift that God gives, not something that he can create us having intrinsically.
Well, so let's address that, because I feel like the response is going to be, well, why doesn't he just give us that gift from the start? Why does he have to? Because now it does sound like it could be argued that he's setting up this arbitrary system where you have to follow these rules before you get this gift. Why doesn't he just give that gift from the start?
Well, the rules are not arbitrary because they are rooted in God's nature. And God did not create man unable to fulfill the requirements of the covenant. Remember, what was Adam's sin? I've been reading through. My daughter is 4, and so we've tried reading scripture with her, but she cannot sit still long enough for me to read a chapter of the Bible. And so that's fine. You don't want to expect more of kids than they can do. But my old systematics professor, Kevin DeYoung, wrote a storybook Bible called The Biggest Story. And it's literally like that thick. It is as thick as a Bible. And as he's explaining the fall to children, he talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he sort of, in a parenthetical way, he says, by the way, knowledge wasn't the bad thing. The tree represented God's authority to say what is right and what is wrong. Now, why should God have that authority? This is me now, not Dr. DeYoung. Why should God have the authority to say what is right and what is wrong? Well, it's because God is infinite, if you remember the catechism, in goodness. So the one who is infinitely good tells us, who are not infinitely good, what is good. But Adam did not want God to tell him what was good. Adam wanted the authority to say what was good and what was bad. And so he took of the fruit. That is, in essence, you are saying, I, who am finite in my goodness, should be able to revise what you who are infinite in your goodness say is good. That can only lead to what we see around us: devastation, suffering, evil. Because the only standard that Adam could set up in opposition to God's standard would be at best an imperfect standard. And what we see is imperfect is the understatement of all of human history. It is the heart of man, as scripture says, is only evil continually. And so God, in his goodness, chose to deal with man by terms of covenants. And I would just dispute that it's an arbitrary standard, because it's not arbitrary. It is a perfect standard. Does that come close to answering?
I think so. My mind also goes to God being perfectly just as well. If he's perfectly just, we talked about why he couldn't create from the start creatures who only ever chose good, because, well, that's not freedom, that's creating creatures without volition. So if he gives them volition, and if he creates them with volition, and if he's perfectly just, there has to be a penalty for failing to meet the standard, for doing wrong. Otherwise, I mean, we wouldn't call a judge just for letting every murderer who came in the courtroom just walk free, right? So in the same way, if God is perfectly just, then there has to be a penalty for sin. So yes, I think, I don't know where I was going with that.
And so
yes,
then it becomes not an arbitrary standard.
Right, yes, thank you for connecting
Yeah.
that. Edit out the parts where I look like an idiot.
We're going to have an episode? No.
Just a solo episode then, all right.
Yeah, but I do think that there is something to your Anselm observation, that in order for man to be a creature, imperfection is part and parcel with that. That the possibility of falling, I think, was sort of baked into it. Now,
I would say
God,
it's necessary.
Yeah. Now, God set up a system where man could be in a state where sin was not possible, but in his created state, it was. And, you know, from our perspective, unfortunately, it happened. What comes of that is the redemption, where God glorifies himself by saving people who don't deserve it. And so it blows my mind a little bit that someone could hear God saves you even though you don't deserve it. And the response is that's a deficiency on God's part, when it embodies and personifies the attitude that Adam had in the garden, that God is holding out on me.
No, he's offering a free gift. While you were saying that, my mind went, I also thought there seems to be a qualitative difference between a being that is created from the start without the ability to choose sin, because again, that's impacting the volition, versus a being that's created with that ability, chooses the wrong thing, and then is redeemed, and as a result, attains the ability to resist sin. If we jump straight to the end, that's no longer the same type of being. If we jump straight to the being that's not able to choose sin, that's no longer a free agent, a free creature, whereas the one who falls and then is redeemed, I think we can say still is meaningfully free, but has undergone sort of, I guess, a change in desires, a change in will.
Yeah, I think what you're articulating is Thomas Aquinas would say, "Oh, blessed fault," and you're, "Oh, blessed fault, what?" But his point was that because of the fall, we got to know God's mercy, not just his justice, but his mercy and his grace. Because in essence, if Adam had kept the covenant from the beginning, then it would be like, yep, we did it. All praise to mankind. Whereas now we say, nope, we messed up. I'm going to reveal myself as a 90s kid. We messed up big time. Like, I've been showing my daughter Rocket Power lately, and they'll be like, super beef. Like, that's all that's in my head right now. But like, we are so far from deserving God's favor, and yet he gives it anyway. We deserved nothing but his wrath, but he sent his son so that we, who were children of wrath, could now be children of God. And so the problem of evil does not create a logical problem for the existence of God. And if you really understand the story of redemption, it doesn't indicate a failure on God's part. It indicates God showing his righteousness, his justice, and his mercy and grace to those of us who don't deserve it. Well, if you have questions, if you have disagreements, atheists, please ask your questions. We would love to interact with you. I have been interacting with Roman Catholics for so long. I am ready to talk about something besides the Pope. So please let us know in the comments what you think about this. As always, please be respectful and considerate of other people. We will not be mean to you. Please show us that same kindness. And if you can do that, I would love to answer any questions that you have. So let us know in the comments. Let us know if there's any other questions that you would like us to tackle. We are always here to provide more information and to give different perspectives. You're even getting different perspectives in this episode. You have a reformed pastor and a non-reformed philosopher.
Non-pastor.
And yet, we're...
Sorry.
I'm sorry?
I said non-pastor.
Yes. Well, my point is that we're coming from different perspectives, but, we still, even in our differences, show respect for each other. That's what I'm trying to make sure that people know in the comments. Because I've gotten some comments that were like I had a short, and I'll figure out some way to edit this so that it sounds okay. But we've gotten comments that are like, you think you know Martin Luther, think again, that kind of thing. And this one guy was like, I know Martin Luther. He's a schismatic heretic and he deserves to be in the flames of perdition. And so
all right,
that's why I'm ending all of these episodes with a plea to please just be respectful, and we'll be respectful of you. That's my point. Let us know any questions that you have. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.